Okay. Oh, look, somebody's online. Okay, sorry I was a little late. I wanted to feel more like Tom Ritchie, so I went and made some tea, and the Keurig was out of water. It was a whole big thing. You know how it is. Okay, oops. Um, so, we are today going to be starting um, where we left off yesterday. So let's go back to talking about Brezhnev and kind of what was going on. So Brezhnev, as you'll remember, was an old school communist leader, very much in the style of Soviet or of Stalin, much more of a conservative ruler. We thought for a while we were going to be able to work with him, and then it just turned out that no, actually, he's going to invade Afghanistan. So that put us in kind of a pickle in the sense that all of the progress that had been made under Détente, under Nixon, basically went back on itself, and we were back in a tense spot with the Soviets. So Brezhnev is going to be in charge of the Soviet Union until he dies in 1982. There is a brief period in between Brezhnev and the next leader where there is this other guy who's in charge for a while. Then there's a sort of a power struggle. But this leads us into the 1980s. And in the 1980s, we get a resurgence of what is called the Atlantic Alliance. So the Atlantic Alliance is basically the major superpowers in the West. So at this point, we've got Ronald Reagan, who is elected president of the United States and is inaugurated in 1980. We have Margaret Thatcher, who is the first woman to hold a head of state position. She is the Prime Minister of Great Britain and comes to power in the UK in 1979. And then we've got Helmut Kohl, who is going to be the leader of West Germany. Alliance, or what these guys are really seeing is they see Germany, or rather not Germany, they see the Soviet Union as a dangerous threat, mostly because of the 1979 invasion, and they are basically going to pledge support to countries who are attempting to throw off Soviet control in the authoritarian control here. And this really works in their advantage when in 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev comes to power as the new Soviet leader. And Mikhail Gorbachev is very much the opposite of Brezhnev. So much like we had much like we had kind of going back and forth with the first few Soviet leaders, Gorbachev is going to be a little bit more liberal than some of the rest of them. And in fact, he is much more willing to negotiate with this Atlantic Alliance, particularly with Ronald Reagan. So Ronald Reagan is pretty famous for his like hardline stance against the Soviet Union. And that's something that Mikhail Gorbachev is going to take pretty seriously, particularly after Ronald Reagan announces his Strategic Defense Initiative. It's called SDI. It's also called Star Wars. You might have heard it called that. Where basically what Reagan announced is what he was going to do is this new like high technological plan. You can see it in the upper right corner there, where he was going to set up this whole system in which they were going to be able to use satellites to figure out when nuclear weapons or ballistic weapons were being shot to the United States. And using those satellites, they were going to be able to intercept those weapons and shoot them out of the air. If that sounds something from a science fiction movie, it's because it was absolutely ridiculous. And scientists were like, hey, Reagan, there's no way we can make this work, man. Like, this is not an idea that we can use. However, in a weird way, it kind of worked because Mikhail Gorbachev was like, oh my God, the Soviets have no way of competing with this sort of power. They actually kind of thought we could do it. And so they got kind of nervous and were much more open and willing to negotiate with us. Gorbachev, when he assumed control of the Soviet Union, he also sought some reforms. I'm going to type two Russian words into the chat over there. So make sure you see those. The first is perestroika. I'm spelling it right. The second is glasnost. these two words basically are the names of the reforms that Gorbachev is going to attempt. Perestroika, which is Russian for restructuring, was basically a restructuring of the Soviet economy. It allowed for some more free market practices in the Soviet economy. Basically, the Soviet economy was bad, and he thought that if we introduce some privatization, it might be able to help it out. If that doesn't sound like communism, it's because it's not, right? So he's actually introducing some capitalist restructuring into the Soviet economy. Then glasnost is a societal openness. Glasnost means openness. And basically what he allowed for the first time is freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. Basically, people can now talk about the things that they are struggling with, which they had not been able to do under Brezhnev and Khrushchev and Stalin. So for the first time, people are able to have access to outside information and see, oh my God, we are actually not doing great, right? Like, we are struggling and the West is not. See, the people of the Soviet Union had been told that, well, yeah, things are bad here, but things are bad in the United States too, which wasn't true. In the 1980s, the United States and the Western economy was doing great. And so this really opened up this idea that, you know what, the Soviet Union is not doing as well as we thought it was doing. So this is going to lead to, again, some more willingness of people in the Soviet Union to seek reforms. In fact, there were free elections in the Soviet Union in 1989 for the first time since 1917. It's a pretty big deal. Gorbachev also withdraws troops from Afghanistan. He encourages reform movements in Poland and Hungary. And he also went back on the Brezhnev doctrine. So this idea that we are going to stop any Eastern Bloc country from reforming. He was like, you know what, guys, this is not going to work. He also signs the most important treaty for nuclear weapons, which is the INF Treaty. It is signed in Washington, D.C., so Gorbachev actually comes to the United States in December of 1987, and it bans all intermediate-range nuclear missiles. So this is really the first successful banning of nuclear missiles during the Cold War. So this is a really big deal. It really represents a milestone of the Cold War tensions. And so as you can see, basically because you've got Gorbachev, who's more open-minded, and then you've got these three hard-lining, conservative leaders who are willing to fight the Cold War again, we are going to see a much bigger reduction in some of the Cold War tensions. So we've gone kind of back and forth, right, depending on who the leader of the Soviet Union is. Stalin, obviously tension is really high. Under Khrushchev, things got a little bit better. Not perfect, but a little bit. Under Brezhnev, things got really bad again. And under Gorbachev, things are getting a little bit better. You may remember hearing, the phrase, this photograph down here is of Ronald Reagan in Berlin. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall, right? And you know what? Eventually it's going to work. You can actually see Cole in the picture to the right, our right, of Ronald Reagan as well. So we're really seeing this reduction of tensions here. So as the Soviet Union is becoming more open, what this is going to lead to is a lot of people in Europe really kind of saying, okay, we see things are not going well for us. We want to fix it, right? So there are going to be a series of revolutions that take place in 1989 that really is going to help lead to the fall of the Soviet Union. So the first one is actually in Poland, and this revolution dates back to 1979. So in 1979, a Polish pope is elected as the leader of the Catholic Church. Poland's a pretty Catholic country. So Pope John Paul II becomes the leader of the Catholic Church, and he goes on kind of a tour of Poland, and he preaches, the love of Christ. He preaches like the rights of man. And this is really going to inspire the Polish people to really start to fight for those rights. And so this begins a movement called the Solidarity Movement. So Solidarity basically is a popular movement for the working people of Poland. It's led by this guy down at the bottom here, Lech Walesa. Basically, they demand the right to form trade unions. They demand the right to strike, the right of freedom of speech, the release of political prisoners, all those kind of things. And for a while, it actually is not very successful. It is made illegal in 1981, just before Gorbachev comes into office, and it is outlawed for a short time, but the Solidarity movement gets a new start in 1989. Basically, Poland re-legalizes the Solidarity movement. Free elections are promised, and they elect their first non-communist leader in any Eastern European country since the Stalin era. This is going to be kind of the start, this trigger that starts these revolutions, the election of this non-communist president in Poland. Lech Walesa actually becomes president himself in 1990. So that's, showing the success of that solidarity movement. In October of 1998, Hungarian leaders proclaim Hungary, an independent country, and they elect a coalition government. In November of 1989, the Berlin Wall comes down. The Berlin Wall had long been that symbol of Eastern and Western Europe, and when it crumbles, it's a huge deal. Germany begins the reunification process, and Germany is reunified in 1990. So Helmut Kohl actually becomes the president of the reunified Germany. The economies are merged. There are going to be some social issues. Eastern Germans actually feel a little kind of secondhand compared to Western Germans, and part of that is because their economy had not been that great. But with the reunification of Germany in 1990, it's a pretty big deal. This is also going to lead to Czechoslovakia's Velvet Revolution. It gets the name the Velvet Revolution because it's really not all that harsh. It's kind of a bloodless revolution. So in December of 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall inspired Czechoslovakia to break away from Soviet influence. There was a general strike. So all of the workers went on strike and protested. This led to the direct fall of the communist government. A playwright is actually elected. He was a dissident playwright who'd been writing against communist regimes. His name is Havel, Havel. He becomes the president. And in 1993, the Czech Republic and Slovakia split into two different countries based on the two different major ethnic groups there. Sorry, Kayla, that Pixie is barking. My neighbors are moving in. Pixie, hush. In Bulgaria in 1989 in November, they have demand the resignation of the Stalinist leaders and purge the Stalinists out. So they are able to get Stalinists out of their country. So Bulgaria declares their independence as well. Just one second. Let me go get that loud, annoying dog. Okay, I'm back to talk about the most violent of the 1989 revolutions, which is Romania. So Romania was under the leadership of this guy right here. I cannot pronounce his name because I do not speak Romanian. So I'm going to try as best I can. Nicolae Ceausescu. That was terrible. But Ceausescu had been a pretty violent dictator in Romania during this period. He'd been in power for a while, and he was overthrown in 1989 and assassinated in December of that year. Now, this revolution, as I said, is pretty violent. 1,000 people die as a result of the revolution, but they are successful in overthrowing Ceausescu and his government. So again, we are seeing all of these Eastern Bloc countries really start to fall apart. Albania, which is the poorest of Europe's countries, are inspired by the overthrow of Ceausescu, and they demonstrate until their Soviet communist government falls in 1991. So the Soviet Union is steadily losing control of the Eastern Bloc, and that's going to become a real problem, as you can imagine, for the Soviet Union's control. And it's going to be a problem particularly because the Soviet Union is not only going to be losing control of the Eastern Bloc, but they're going to be losing control of their satellite states as well, and of their own government. There are some reasons for this. So some of the long-term causes that we have here, the cost of maintaining these satellite states was just way too high. You know, the cost of maintaining an empire in general is always really high, and they had a problem with that. Their middle class is starting to form again, and they want reforms, especially after the whole glasnost thing. So that's really a big deal. General elections are held, which are going to lead to the elections of non-Soviet rulers. There is an economic crisis throughout Europe in the 70s, and communism is obviously not working, and so that leads to the collapse. The economic crisis really helps kind of show that. And so the other thing that happens is there is a lot of nationalist resentment. All of these countries are full of ethnic groups that are not Russian, and the Russians have not been treating ethnic groups well at all. And so this nationalism in these countries is really going to lead to their own forms of nationalist leaders. So the Soviet Union is quickly losing control. The Soviets actually see Gorbachev as pretty weak because, as you can imagine, they do not like losing control of all of their satellite nations here. And so in 1991, there is a coup in Moscow. So a coup as in like a coup d'etat, C-O-U-P. And basically, frustrated by the loss of Soviet territory and the loss of Soviet prestige, the really conservative, hardliner communists, like Brezhnev communists, come in and attempt to overthrow Gorbachev. Now, the coup actually fails when the military, this is kind of confusing, but basically what happens is there is a military who is told to fire on a popular resistance movement. And the military refuses to fire and crush the popular resistance. So a guy named Boris Yeltsin becomes a national hero when he basically stands in front of these tanks and he's like, crush me, do it. Right? And of course, they don't do it. But the coup really weakens Gorbachev as leader, and he will soon be driven out. In fact, Yeltsin and his liberal allies, so Yeltsin is a liberal, he's not one of the hardline conservatives, but he declares Russia an independent and says we are going to withdraw from the Soviet Union. And so on December 25th, 1991, the Soviet Union is officially dissolved into 15 separate and independent republics. Russia assumes the Soviet Union seat on the UN Council, and the Cold War is over? Question mark. Well, no, it's not really. The Soviet Union is gone, but the Cold War is still really going to struggle as Boris Yeltsin's government is going to try and improve the Soviet standing. However, they had problems transitioning to a traditional market economy. So they're trying to transition to that more liberal, free market, open economy. But he's going to struggle with it. It's slow and painful. He also gets into a power struggle in 1993 with the conservative parliament of Russia. So parliament leaders basically tried to assault the Kremlin, and the Kremlin is kind of like the White House. So Yeltsin has to kind of fight back. The biggest problem that Yeltsin faces, however, is in Chechnya. So if you look at this map down on the bottom corner there, Chechnya is the little spot in red. So Chechnya, again, I'll write the name of Chechnya in the chat for you, so you make sure you spell it right. But Chechnya is an area of Russia which is almost entirely Muslim. Okay, so the Muslims in this area basically want to be separate from Russia. They realize that the Russians have not been treating them well. There's violence. that's been going on against the Muslim people, and so they want to break away. So basically what happens is violence between the government forces and the rebels. This has been going on for almost a decade, but it's just consistent insurgency. So kind of similar to the problems we've been facing in Iraq and Afghanistan in recent years, these guerrilla-style fighting. And Yeltsin proves that he really just can't keep up with it. So on New Year's Day of 2000, Yeltsin officially resigns, saying it's because of poor health, but really it's a combination of poor health and lack of popularity in Russia. And he is succeeded by our very favorite former KGB colonel, Vladimir Putin. Right? So Putin is very old school Russian, and he comes in really to kind of re-centralize power, really kind of going back to the way things were. But essentially what we have in Russia now is the Russia that we see today. So just some things to be aware of just in Eastern Europe in general. So the shift to a market economy proves pretty difficult. The economic activity of the area declines by almost a third. Poland is the most successful. Yay, go Poland. Czechoslovakia actually does pretty well itself. Hungary, while their economy had already been a more free market economy, they're still changing much more slowly. By 1995, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary were doing well enough to join the EU, the European Union, which we'll talk more about later. But there are some continuing problems in Eastern Europe. Mainly unemployment is about 15% throughout the region. Inflation still to this day remains dangerously high. The governments are in very large debt. And in 1995, former communists actually returned to power in many of those countries. Even though capitalism remains the economic system, they still elected communist leaders. So the very last country that I want to talk about today is Yugoslavia. So you may remember at the beginning of the 60s, Yugoslavia was the only independent communist country in Europe. And it continued to remain so. Tito remained in power for quite some time. And then we are going to have a shift in power. But there are a couple things I want you to notice about Yugoslavia here. So first of all, that whole green area is Yugoslavia. Now, when you look at it, you will see that it is actually maintained, or it is actually several different provinces within the whole of Yugoslavia, namely Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, Serbia, and Macedonia. Okay, so Serbia is kind of the one that's in the most control. They are the biggest ethnic group. So in 1990, President Milosevic, which I'm sure, again, I am saying terribly, he seeks a Serbian-dominated Yugoslavia, right? So he establishes much tighter central control over previous autonomous regions. So these different little republics had kind of run themselves within Yugoslavia itself. But now he's coming in and saying, no, 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 you've got to answer to Serbia. And they are not okay with that. So Croatia and Slovenia declare their independence, and each are successfully able to fight off Serbia. Bosnia-Herzegovina declares its independence in 1992, and a civil war happens there. Bosnian Serbs, which are about 30% of the population, basically refuse to live in a Muslim-dominated state, right? Well, they begin military operations assisted by Serbia and the Yugoslavia Federal Army, and the major Bosnian city of Sarajevo is under attack. As a result of this, the Bosnian Serbs basically try to ethnically cleanse the area of Muslims by shelling cities, confiscating or destroying houses, expulsion, murder, gang rape. This is the world's most recent genocide. So this genocide which takes place in the early 90s. You'll often hear called the Bosnian Genocide, which was a genocide against Muslims in Bosnia. This photograph down here at the bottom is actually a photograph of bodies who were killed in the Bosnian Genocide to spell out the phrase "end genocide now." So this is really a powerful picture. There's another one that you can find online where they say enough, right? So in 1995, there is an agreement called the Dayton Agreements. They basically agree to divide Bosnia between the Muslims and the Serbs. The Bosnian Serbs, basically, if you look kind of where it is, they kind of divide it in half. That's why there's two different names there. That doesn't end the problems, however. In 1999, there is an attempt to ethnically cleanse Kosovo, which is a province of Serbia. You can see it down at the bottom of the map there, where basically they try to cleanse it of ethnic Albanians. Albania, you'll see, is a country just to the south of former Yugoslavia, and he tries to get rid of Albanians, which are, again, mostly Muslims, in Kosovo. NATO is actually comes in to put a stop to this, to stop the ethnic cleansing. And in 2000, Milosevic is finally removed from power. He's placed under international charges for war crimes, and he died in prison in 2006 before he was tried. Montenegro actually becomes the last of these countries to vote for independence in 2006, which is the official end of Yugoslavia. So not until all of these different areas vote for independence does Yugoslavia finally get wiped off the European map. So that's where I want to end it today, just wrapping up kind of the effects of modern Europe in Eastern Europe. We will come back to talk about Western Europe and kind of what it was doing through all of this. But I hope you guys learned a little something, and I will see you guys soon. Bye-bye.